5 years after my passing, Ethan came back from overseas. The guy who was once broke to the bone and whom I had coldly left behind. Now, after years of grinding, he had risen to become the hottest up-and-coming mogul in the business scene. He returned here, aiming to catch me in my deepest sorrow. But little did he know, I had been gone for quite some time. As Ethan stepped out of the airport, a flood of journalists welcomed him. The man who used to be so destitute he couldn't even afford a simple necklace, once on his knees begging me not to leave, was now flanked by squads of bodyguards and a stunning girlfriend. His eyes were sharp and icy, nothing like his old self. My spirit lingered in the crowd, observing him from afar. Whether it was the 7 years we hadn't seen each other or how drastically he'd changed, I couldn't even place him for a split second. It wasn't until my dad's hoarse, weary voice cut through the clamor beside me that I recognized him. "Ethan, I'm Clara's father." "Clara, do you remember me?" My haze cleared, realizing Ethan had truly come back. 7 years after we parted ways and 5 years since my death, he was here. I followed my dad and arrived at the scene, gazing at that face that was both familiar and foreign. A wave of dizziness hit me, followed by a sharp pain enveloping my entire body. Ethan and I, had we really drifted so far apart? My dad kept shouting, and some reporters started to notice him too. Ethan probably caught the commotion, but he just gave a casual look down, his eyes scanning past my dad. Without changing his demeanor, he continued toward the airport exit. As his guards cleared the path, and he was about to hop into the car and leave, my dad's emotions spiraled out of control. He pushed and shoved through the crowd, desperate to reach Ethan. "Ethan, please wait. For the sake of my daughter Clara, help our family." Ethan finally halted, turning to face my dad with a cold, mocking gleam in his eyes. After a long pause, he responded indifferently, "Sorry, who are you talking about?" It seemed he didn't recognize either of us. A sharp sting of pain shot through my heart. Even if he had forgotten me after 7 years, it wasn't entirely surprising. Maybe even if he hadn't forgotten, his feelings for me had turned to pure animosity. My dad stood there, stunned and frozen. The crowd started mocking and sneering. They thought he knew Ethan, but it was clear he was just trying to make a connection. Look how disheveled he looked. How could Ethan possibly know him? My dad's aged face turned pale and green with embarrassment. Once a respected figure, he had fallen from grace and, after years in jail, was released only to find that I had already passed away. And my sister, unable to cope with the grief, had been in a coma from a car crash for years, clinging to life thanks to money. Over these years, my dad had exhausted every possible way to borrow money. His pride and dignity were shattered. When Ethan saw my dad go silent, he opened his car door to get in. But right in front of everyone, my dad dropped to his knees with a loud thud. "Ethan, I beg you, please help us. We're desperate. The hospital gave us an ultimatum. Pay up or they won't keep treating my sister." I had never seen my dad kneel before, and my heart twisted painfully. But now, as a spirit, I couldn't even lift a finger to aid him. Cameras zoomed in on my dad, capturing his most humiliating moment. Ethan watched impassively until the reporters had their fill. Then he whispered something to his bodyguard. Soon the guard approached, helped my dad up, and brought him before Ethan. My dad's face was ashen, but his eyes sparkled with hope when he looked at Ethan, filled with excitement and surprise. "Ethan, please lend me 100 grand. Clara's condition is critical. I promise to pay you back as soon as I can," my dad pleaded. Ethan chuckled softly, cutting him off bluntly. "I can lend you the money, but first Clara needs to come and kneel. Then I'll think about it." My dad looked at Ethan in anguish, his face trembling as he tried to continue. "But Clara, my Clara, she's already—" He couldn't finish, tears welling up in his eyes. Ethan understood and simply said, "I'm not interested. Her kneeling must be valuable. Only someone like Jake should kneel, right?" Jake, the guy I'd married 7 years ago. Also, the reason Ethan saw me as having abandoned him. I met Ethan when I was 12 that winter. On the day the first snow fell, my childhood friend Jake took me to the bridge underpass, where I saw Ethan and his mother, looking rough and worn. Ethan's dad had been involved in financial crimes and had jumped to his death before being arrested. Mother and son were homeless, drifting when they arrived here. Kids were mocking them, and Jake eagerly led me into the group. Pointing at a shivering, tough-looking Ethan, he said, "See, does he look like a puppy making noises?" I got so mad I kicked Jake in the shin and shot back, "I think you sound more like a barking dog." I chased the other kids away, and instead of giving the breakfast I bought Jake, I handed it to Ethan and his mom. That's when my bond with Ethan began. The rivalry between Jake and Ethan started then. I often brought them stuff and chatted with them. Ethan had no friends after his family troubles. I was the only one he talked to. Usually, I did the talking and he listened. He always acted indifferent, saying I was too loud and annoying. But whenever someone bullied me, he'd knock them out, sending them to the hospital's ER. Later, the hospital asked him to write a self-criticism to read aloud at school. Refusing to write it, I feared he'd get expelled, so I penned 1,000 words for him. On Monday, he stood beneath the national flag. After reading the self-criticism, he added, "I'll include my own thoughts. Whoever messes with Clara again, I'll still take them down." The principal, who had been relieved, was now visibly irritated. Ethan always kept his word. When my family fell apart and I had to work, my boss took advantage of me. Just then, Ethan called, and when he heard me crying, he rushed to the private room. He grabbed a bottle and smashed it on my boss's head, causing a cut. My boss was rushed to the hospital with a serious head injury and was in a coma for 2 months. During that time, both Ethan and I were powerless and were aggressively sued by my boss and his family for what happened. Because of that incident, Ethan ended up spending over 6 months in jail. Before being taken by the police, he stayed up all night helping me arrange food, clothing, and living expenses, worrying I couldn't take care of myself. So everyone knew that I, Clara, had a guardian angel. If anyone dared to mess with me, he'd retaliate. Those events now seemed like distant memories. My mind drifted back to the present, watching Ethan's cold and indifferent face. My dad stood before Ethan, looking frail and fragile like a dry tree in the wind. He murmured, "No, my Clara isn't like that." He never mentioned that I was already dead. Maybe he couldn't bring himself to say it, or refused to accept it over the years. Often at night, he held my photo and talked to himself. "Clara, why aren't you home yet?" Ethan grew impatient as my dad fell silent again and left without a word. My dad had planned to return to the hospital, but his phone rang. The hospital called to inform him of an urgent need for a bed. If we couldn't cover the medical bills by nightfall, my sister would have to stop her treatment and move to a hallway bed. My dad listened to the voice on the other end. The autumn wind tousled his hair, revealing a few gray strands. He hesitated before responding faintly, finally gritting his teeth, calling a cab, and following Ethan in his car. 7 years ago, when I broke up with Ethan, my dad was still in jail. He didn't fully grasp how ugly our breakup was, or the hardships Ethan faced then. He only knew Ethan and I were deeply in love. That's why he believed Ethan might still have lingering feelings for me. When the car stopped at their destination and Ethan led his girlfriend inside without a glance at my dad was left outside looking pale and disheveled. He waited until nightfall, only to hear the same message relayed by the maid on Ethan's behalf. "If you want the money, let Clara come and kneel." In the living room, I saw Lily, whom I hadn't seen in 7 years. She sat beside Ethan, frowning and saying something. Ethan's girlfriend must have gone upstairs to rest. Lily, who had been terminally ill 7 years ago, now looked much healthier. I breathed a sigh of relief for her. Thoughts of past events and my current situation pierced my heart, but somehow, it all felt worth it. I heard Lily sigh. "What's going on between you and this woman? If the news spreads, Clara will be heartbroken." Little did she know I was already dead. From the moment she first saw me, Lily always called me gently Clara. She was the kindest, most compassionate person. When I started dating Ethan, Clara's family wasn't falling apart yet. She always reminded Ethan to treat me well. But when Clara's family faced troubles and declined, she cried and urged Ethan to take care of me and stay by my side. When my dad was in jail, my sister was seriously ill, and our family was drowning in debt. Lily stayed up all night comforting me while everyone else avoided us. She even sold her hard-earned house and a family heirloom bracelet to help pay my sister's medical bills. She said that in tough times, the family should stick together. I grew up with only my dad, no mother. So when I met Lily, she felt like a mother to me. She was as kind as Ethan was. Later, when I found out she had end-stage liver cirrhosis and might not make it, I felt my world crumble. I cried all night until Jake approached me, saying he'd found a way to get a suitable liver for Lily. Unfortunately, the devil never does charity, only trades. Years later, I still vividly remember that night. In the noisy, rain-soaked private room, Ethan, looking completely disheveled, came to find me. With a pleading look in his eyes, he said, "Clara, don't leave me. Please wait for me." I told him I was from a wealthy family and Jake could provide for me. Everyone in the room laughed. Despite the pain in my heart, I managed to fake a sweet smile and said, "You're begging me. How about you kneel down and then I'll think about it?" I thought that would hurt him enough to end things. But Ethan, always proud and never backing down, actually knelt before me that night. He looked at me, distant, making me feel like we were from different worlds. "Clara, I'll do everything you want." At the time, he had disregarded Jake, who had been pursuing me resentfully. In that moment, I felt as miserable as a drenched dog. He knelt in front of me and Jake. Jake had never smiled so happily before, his face contorted with joy. Ethan had his moment. Look at him, he's got his moment too. What can he use to compete with me for Clara, huh? Ethan seemed like he couldn't hear me. In the dim light, he only looked at me, pleading with his eyes, waiting for my answer, until I touched the necklace around my neck and replied with a smile, "But the efforts of the poor are worthless. This necklace cost over 2 million. How long do you have to work hard for it? 10 years, 20 years, or a lifetime? Ethan, I'm tired of this poverty game." In the private room, thunderous laughter erupted again. I couldn't recall what happened next or how Ethan left. I only remembered that, for 7 full years, he hadn't returned from overseas. My thoughts snapped back. I heard Ethan's annoyed voice. "Mom, why bring up those people? It sounds like I'm talking about something dirty." Lily's face turned ugly. "I know you're still mad at Clara, but what happened 7 years ago might have been a misunderstanding." For a moment, I was stunned. Because of the sentence, my nose felt sour. Ethan visibly avoided any topics related to me. "It's late, Mom. You better rest early. Those are things of the past." Lily seemed reminded of something, her emotions suddenly agitated. "I know you don't believe her, but let me tell you, I do." She stood up straight, her eyes firm as she looked at her son. If Clara was truly a vain person, she wouldn't have helped our family before they fell apart, and she wouldn't have taken an interest in you either. As for Jake, he had been chasing after her since we were kids. How could she suddenly be interested in his money 7 years ago? My eyes welled up. It turned out someone had believed in me all along. Suddenly, I didn't know whether to rejoice in fooling Ethan 7 years ago or regret that he never saw through my lies over these 7 years. We used to be so in sync without saying a word. A single glance from me, and he could read my mind. Ethan fell silent for a brief moment. He seemed like he wanted to argue but didn't say anything. He only told the housekeeper to take care of his mother and went upstairs with a stern face. Lily's expression, mixed with anger, watched his back. "How many years have passed? Have you really let go of her?" My heart skipped a beat as Ethan stopped halfway up the stairs. I didn't know why, but I suddenly felt nervous. Maybe deep down, I also wanted to know the answer. Ethan didn't respond, just stood silently facing away from the lower floor. Lily urgently continued, "If you've truly moved on from Clara, why did you come back 5 years ago?" She couldn't finish her sentence. Ethan suddenly turned around, cutting her off coldly. "Mom, enough. Stop mentioning her, okay? 5 years ago was when I died." Thinking about those past moments felt like reopening a wound. The night before I died, I actually contacted Ethan. That was the only call we had in the 7 years since we split. At that time, Lily had already had a liver transplant and was nearly recovered. Jake had asked for a divorce from me. We had been separated from Ethan for 2 years by then, so why did I still reach out to him? Maybe I clung to a ridiculous, fanciful idea of starting anew. After all, the 2 years of marriage with Jake weren't good. I suffered from anorexia, constantly thinking about Ethan. One day, sitting at the vanity, I realized I was aging from frequent insomnia and loss of appetite. Jake stood behind me, looking at me through the mirror with pity in his eyes, then sighed disdainfully. "Clara, you look old. It's weird. After getting married, I realized you weren't as beautiful as before." He, The guy who'd pursued me for over 10 years, the man who claimed to love me, grew tired of me less than 2 years after marrying me. At that moment, I suddenly remembered a sentence Ethan had said to me. I hope that when we're old and gray, we can still hold hands and live out the rest of our lives. I found his sentimentality and drama ridiculous back then, but it haunted me night after night, bringing tears to my eyes. Jake started staying out more often at night. More young, pretty girls surrounded him. Later, there was one girl who was very good at throwing tantrums, clinging tightly. She wanted to marry him and push me away. Jake then asked for a divorce. That night, he told me, Clara, I'm letting you go. You can go back to Ethan and start fresh. The night we divorced, I couldn't resist. I really reached out to Ethan. The feeling was strange when I dialed that all too familiar number. It was a mix of guilt, shame, immense excitement, and unrestrained longing. Until Ethan coldly told me over the phone he was getting married soon. Clara, do you want to come? I have you to thank after all. What was my answer back then? The memory as a spirit is limited. I seem to be forgetting many things, including some very important ones. I only remember that the next day, while driving, I seemed to receive a call from Jake. I forgot what he said. Then I suffered a sudden heart attack. And then, the car accident and death. I detached myself from the memories. Hearing Lily sigh and soften her voice, if you don't want to go find Clara again, I'll go to her myself tomorrow. If you don't want to go find Clara again, I'll go to her myself tomorrow. I found out she got divorced 5 years ago. Ethan tensed. His face stayed silent for a long time. Eventually, he replied casually, go ahead, and went upstairs to the bedroom. He greeted and told the maid not to tell Lily I was standing outside. My dad waited in the cold wind until late at night but couldn't get help from Ethan's family. He returned home dazed, not even turning on the lights. In the dim moonlight, he went upstairs to the bedroom and opened a safe. Inside, everything that could be sold for money was gone, except one last item, a gold-trimmed jade longevity lock. It was specially made by a master when I was born, and my dad was overjoyed. The master said as long as the lock was there, I would always be safe and free from disasters. After so many years, it could still fetch around 100 grand, enough for my sister's medical bills. My dad took out the golden lock and held it in his hand, rubbing it back and forth with his fingertips. He sat on the floor, his body trembling, eyes bloodshot, as if making a final struggle. Over the years, he had deluded himself. In the dead of night, he fantasized that I was still alive and would come back sooner or later. Now, at a dead end, having to sell this last valuable item, he had to admit the precious longevity lock was no longer useful. I was dead. His beloved daughter was gone. What could a supposed longevity lock meant to ensure safety do now? My dad's palm trembled, and a sob escaped his throat. After a long time, he finally stopped rubbing the lock, a tear falling on its surface. His voice trembled softly. Clara, it'll only take a short while. Dad promises to redeem it soon. He rushed back to the hospital overnight to care for Jessica. The doctor solemnly informed him she had been in a coma for years. Even if he raised the money for further treatment, there was no guarantee she'd survive. My dad stood in the doctor's office, listening dazedly. When the doctor finished, he hoarsely replied, just keep treating her. The next morning, he sold the longevity lock and paid for Jessica's medical expenses. I followed him, watching him hurry in and out. I wanted to tell him to slow down. He had heart disease and had aged so much now. Being anxious and agitated could worsen his health. I wanted to say all these words of concern, but he couldn't hear me. I stayed with him in the hospital. On the third afternoon, Jake unexpectedly showed up. Jake had always believed my death was somehow related to him. He knew me. I was strong-willed. No matter how tough things got, I'd never consider ending my life. 5 years ago, I died in a car crash the day after divorcing Jake. So, even without evidence, my dad harbored extreme hatred towards Jake. When Jake arrived, dressed in a suit, he looked even more haggard than before. I thought after all these years, he'd moved on, found someone new, and should be living comfortably. As soon as he entered the ward, he placed a black card in front of my dad. With a smug smile, he said, "Heard things have been rough for you guys, so here's some money to spend." My dad sat by Jessica's bed, stood up at the sight. He stared at Jake with eyes almost tearing with hatred. His voice was full of anger, but tried to stay calm. Get out now. Jake raised an eyebrow, looking helpless. Just like Clara, you don't know how to appreciate kindness. My dad's chest heaved with anger, breathing rapid. You don't deserve to mention my Clara. Get out. Jake half raised his hands in a calming gesture, pretending to console my dad. As he stepped closer, my dad's coughing worsened. Jake didn't approach further, and there was a mist in his eyes. For a moment, I even felt I was mistaken. Jake chuckled slightly dazedly, saying, Evidence! Evidence that I killed Clara. Don't joke around. I loved Clara the most. As he said this, my dad coughed so hard he could barely breathe. I panicked, screaming for help, but no one heard me. I watched as my dad, after violent coughing, spat out blood. Panicking, I screamed for help, but no one could hear me. After my dad finished coughing up blood, his face turned pale quickly. Like a withering leaf in the wind, his body began to crouch down dead slowly. Suddenly, someone burst into the room from outside. The person had a dark complexion and grabbed Jake's shoulder, pulling him away. Jake was caught off guard, stumbled, and awkwardly fell to the ground. As he got up and saw the intruder clearly, he didn't seem angry. Instead, his eyes reddened as he laughed. The fool is finally back in the country. It was Ethan who had entered, along with his mother. Ethan had been searching for days and finally found his way here. He claimed to have caught a cold and come to the hospital by chance, only to run into his mother. In the corridor outside, I overheard Ethan saying, even with a high fever of 104 degrees, they have to convene a meeting of executives first, and they come to the hospital for a little cold. Wanting to bask in my glory, just say you're here to find Clara. Ethan remained silent throughout the confrontation. When Jake looked at him, it was as if he was witnessing a colossal joke. 7 years later, you're finally back in the country. Ignoring Jake, Ethan helped my dad up, while his mother called for medical staff. My dad was quickly rushed to the emergency room, and once confirmed stable, I breathed a sigh of relief. Ethan followed the medical staff, who pushed my dad into the ward. Sitting on a chair outside the ward, Ethan stared at the white wall in front of him, his gaze unfocused. It was then I noticed how much weight he had lost. Even though he exuded elegance in his suit, he couldn't hide the deep fatigue in his eyes. Ignoring his disgust, Jake sat down beside him somewhat provocatively. So, back to the country to pick up Clara. He was referring to my ashes. But Ethan didn't understand and quickly sneered, Pick her up! Maybe I'll consider it when she kneels in front of me. This was something I had told him before. Perhaps it had truly wounded him back then, causing him to now repeatedly seek me. Jake paused, looking at Ethan with a mix of surprise after staring for a while. His expression turned intensely as if he had just discovered something groundbreaking. You don't really know yet, do you? Ignoring Jake, Ethan continued staring at the wall, seeming lost in thought. It wasn't until Jake's shocked voice rang out. You really don't know, do you? Clara died 5 years ago? Silence enveloped the surroundings. My heart seemed to rise to my throat for a moment. Suddenly, I wondered if this news of my death, 5 years late, had finally reached Ethan's ears. How would he feel now? It had been 7 years since we last met. And perhaps whether it was love or hate, it had all faded. Maybe there wouldn't be much feeling left at all. Indeed, Ethan didn't react much. When Jake's voice fell, he just fell silent for a moment, furrowing his brow slightly. There was no sadness on his face, but he quickly chuckled. Is that so? When did she die? In that moment, my heart felt like it had been pierced by a needle. Then it hit me. I was dead. Dead people only have souls, not bodies. But why did the pain feel so real? Jake probably didn't expect Ethan to react this way. The smile on his face vanished, replaced by disbelief as he stared at the man next to him, now cold and emotionless, as if staring at a monster. After a while, he finally exclaimed in anger, Ethan, Clara is dead, and you're not even sad. Ethan's expression remained unchanged. It was Jake, usually devoid of emotion, who seemed like an affectionate clown at that moment. Jake seemed unable to accept the reaction before him, his face contorted in what seemed like agony. You're not sad." "Ethan, how can you not be sad? How can you not be sad?" "Ethan, Clara is dead. She died in a car accident 5 years ago." I didn't expect Jake to react so strongly to my death at this moment. 5 years ago, when we divorced, there was no love left between us. Even at my funeral, as my ex-husband, he didn't shed a tear. But now, I saw him with red-rimmed eyes. And Ethan remained like an outsider, indifferent to a matter that didn't concern him. He coldly watched Jake teetering on the edge of collapse, finding it somewhat amusing. "Sad? What about her is worth my sadness?" This remark was like a spark that made Jake suddenly lose control. His eyes filled with rage and resentment, mixed with other incomprehensible emotions. He stood up abruptly, approaching Ethan and grabbing the man's collar fiercely. With all his might, he landed a vicious punch on Ethan's face, almost hitting his nose. Upon impact, blood appeared on Ethan's face. Ethan fell to the ground, and for the first time, his usually calm face showed a hint of a different emotion. Not anger, but confusion. Deep confusion. He didn't even raise a hand to wipe away the blood, just looked at Jake strangely, his eyes filled with bewilderment. He seemed not to understand why Jake had struck him. With veins of blood in his eyes, Jake stared at the man who had fallen to the ground. "Clara is dead, and all because of you. It's all your fault." His eyes brimmed with anger and resentment before slowly being suppressed, turning into pain and confusion. He crouched down, hugging himself, shuddering and shaking. "Not you, it's me. I killed Clara. It's me. I'm the murderer." He seemed to be going crazy, or perhaps trapped in a nightmare, repeating these words over and over. Ethan finally frowned, stood up, and looked at the man crouching and muttering, his voice full of disgust, but also a hint of restrained tremble. "Are you insane? Is this joke funny?" For a long time, Jake didn't speak again. He slowly lowered his hands from covering his face, palms trembling as he removed his hands. I saw his hands, shoulders, and then his whole body trembling, consumed by immense pain. Frankly, as I watched him, I felt a mix of amusement and disgust. He was the root of all my nightmares. If it weren't for him, I wouldn't have ended up like this today. The person in this world least deserving of mourning my death was him. After what seemed like an eternity, Jake finally released his hands from covering his face. He stood up slowly, looking strange and desolate. Without looking at Ethan, he walked fragmented and lost, like a wandering soul, toward the end of the hallway. Ethan stared at his retreating figure, his expression turning increasingly grim. He could clearly hear Jake's voice growing distant, sounding like a mumble. "Yes, it's a joke. This joke isn't funny. Clara didn't die." The sound grew fainter and eventually disappeared at the end of the corridor along with Jake's figure. Ethan's face had turned dark, resembling a thundercloud. Just like Lily, Ethan had always been a well-mannered person who rarely lost control. But today, for the second time, he almost gritted his teeth and cursed to himself. Crazy. No one responded to his words. He started to feel irritated, took out a pack of cigarettes and a lighter from his pocket, muttering curses under his breath. Divorce, and then cursing people to death. Crazy. It was late at night. The only response to his presence was prolonged silence in the corridor. Ethan took a cigarette out of the pack and tried to light it with the lighter. Despite its simplicity, he struggled to ignite the cigarette for quite some time. Just then, a nurse happened to pass by, on her way to the ward to change a patient's medication. Seeing Ethan trying to light the cigarette, the young woman reminded him, "Sir, please smoke over there." Ignoring her, Ethan kept trying to light the cigarette. The flame flickered between his fingers, unable to catch fire. It was only when the nurse's voice cut through the silence that he seemed to snap out of a daze. His hand trembled, causing the lighter, the pack of cigarettes, and the cigarette between his lips to fall to the ground. He looked up abruptly at the nurse. Since his return to the country, he had always had cold and distant eyes. But in the deep night like this, there was no longer any disguise in his eyes. They were filled with profound confusion and helplessness. The nurse was taken aback by his reaction and kindly picked up the fallen items, handing them back to him, asking with concern, "Sir, are you okay?" Ethan stared at the nurse's face for a long time, seeming to be lost in a daze once again. It wasn't until the young woman's ears turned red that he finally came back to his senses. Taking the items back, his voice slightly trembling, he replied, "I'm fine, thank you." The nurse quickly left, and Ethan suddenly appeared agitated, taking out his phone hastily. I was a bit surprised to see that without hesitation, he directly accessed my social media profile. I thought he had deleted me a long time ago. During the 2 years when I split up with him and married Jake, I only posted sporadic updates, mostly related to work. However, in the 5 years since my death, my account had been consistently active with frequent updates about my happy and fulfilling life. Every post featured the same person, Jake. The most recent post was from last night, a photo taken at a restaurant of a small apartment I once owned. The table was set with a romantic candlelit dinner. In the flickering candlelight way, two hands were interlocked. One hand wore a Cartier men's watch, clearly Jake's. The other hand was slender and fair-skinned, wearing the wedding ring Jake and I had. It was unmistakably mine. I had known all along that these posts were made by Jake. After my death, he had taken my phone. In some twisted way, he had been using my identity and account to post updates portraying Clara deeply in love with Jake, which I found utterly disgusting, but couldn't stop. My sister had been seriously ill for years, and my dad, after being released from prison, was busy raising money for medical expenses. Moreover, Jake had blocked my family from viewing these posts, so they never found out. A few of Jake's friends had tried to dissuade him through numerous phone calls over the years, expressing their discomfort. "Can you please stop? It's really creepy." But unfortunately, it didn't make any difference. I watched as Ethan scrolled through my posts, one by one, until he reached the 7-year mark. He seemed not to have noticed anything amiss yet. After going through them twice, his finger suddenly stopped at one particular post. It was the first fake post Jake had created using my account 5 years ago. In the photo, Jake held my hand, interlocking our fingers over a necklace on my collarbone. Even though I had seen this fake post before, I couldn't help but shiver uncontrollably. It wasn't just the words written, but also because the image in the photo was already dead. It was the first day of my death. Before I was pushed into the crematorium, Jake crouched next to my body. He held my hand and took that photo. It marked the starting point of a stark transition in my social media posts. Ethan stared at the post for a long time. His expression grew increasingly strange. Finally, he seemed to realize that something was off. He quickly enlarged the photo and scrutinized it. "Fakes can't hide all their flaws, can they?" My skin color in the photo appeared unnaturally pale. There were some faint bloody smudges on the side of my face and neck that hadn't been cleaned properly, and traces of the wound on my face covered by makeup were faintly visible. It was apparent that Ethan was seeing the photo and inspecting it thoroughly for the first time. He zoomed in and repositioned the image. Soon his fingers began to tremble, and his breathing became heavy. It was as if he had torn open the first seam leading to the truth, and the opening was rapidly widening. Trembling, Ethan hastily scrolled through the other posts, unable to contain his impatience. With so many inconsistencies, he could no longer overlook them. The tone of the posts made in the last 5 years, by my account, was noticeably different from my usual way of speaking. Surprisingly, not a single post in nearly 100 contained my face. During the 2 years of my marriage to Jake, there hadn't been a single post related to him, and right from the second day of our divorce, I began relentlessly sharing posts of our love life. It was as if I had become a completely different person 5 years ago. Ethan was no fool. At this moment, a truth was staring him in the face. I didn't post those updates for the past 5 years. And yet, the false updates have been out for 5 years, and I never tried to stop them. The reason might just be. Ethan suddenly stood up and almost stormed into my dad's hospital room. I saw a strange crimson glint in his eyes. My dad had just come out of the emergency room and was conscious. He had just gotten off the hospital bed and wanted to go upstairs to see my sister. Lily was trying to stop him, saying, "You should lie down and rest. I have someone watching over Jessica." The two of them were at a standstill when suddenly Ethan burst in. They were both startled by his dark and intimidating appearance. Ethan took out his wallet, emptied all the cash inside, and then grabbed a bank card. Finally, he stuffed the cash, along with the card, into my dad's hand. Despite trying to control himself, his emotions were clearly on the brink of spiraling out of control. It was like a heavily snow-loaded mountain, about to collapse at any moment. He stared at my dad and almost pleaded, Take whatever money you need. Just tell me, where is Clara? My dad had been in a rush to leave, but upon hearing those words, he froze as if paralyzed. Another expression of intense agony appeared on his face. Years ago, when Ethan had just returned from overseas, he had seen a similar expression on my dad at the airport. Back then, Ethan had seemed indifferent, even impatient. But now, facing my dad's expression, his hands slowly clenched. It was as if he unconsciously tightened his grip, then tried to relax his palms. But in an instant, his hands clenched into fists uncontrollably, trembling and quivering, veins popping out on the back of his hands. His tone softened, as if he was trying to find a gentle and effective way to talk to my dad, asking about my whereabouts. I don't want to cause her trouble. I really don't. I just have just a few things, to ask her. My dad's aged face trembled, his lips parted, but he seemed lost in thought, unable to say a word. Finally, with a choking voice, he managed to say, Clara? She? Ethan stared at my dad as if trying to bore a hole through him, searching for any clue about my location. He kept urging my dad to stay calm and speak slowly, but the one who couldn't seem to calm down was him. Where is Clara? Why won't you say? Is she avoiding me, too scared to see me? I've forgotten all those things. I'm getting married now. With an eager tone, he pulled out a wedding invitation photo from his phone, showing a picture of himself and his girlfriend Maya. It reminded me of the night 5 years ago when he had said the same thing to me, whether he was lying or just busy with work all these years. And now the wedding had been postponed until today. He was eager to show the photo to my dad, but before he could hand it over, my dad's trembling voice spoke up. Clara has passed away. Ethan froze in the middle of reaching out with his phone. My dad seemed to have lost his soul, murmuring, 5 years ago, the day after Clara divorced Jake, she got into a car accident and left us. Ethan's body seemed completely frozen in place. Lily was struck as if by lightning, her face a mix of sorrow and disbelief. Unable to bear it, she turned pale and collapsed to the ground. The maid hurried in to call the doctor and helped her out of the room. I knew that Lily had been wanting to return to her homeland for a long time, but after her liver transplant, she had severe rejection reactions. She had been living in the hospital almost all these years, unable to travel back due to her health. With Ethan's interference, she had tried many times to return, but only managed it now. After Lily left, only my dad and Ethan were left in the room. Staring at each other, both looked like puppets without souls. My dad stared blankly at Ethan and finally spoke softly. Ethan, I heard you hate my daughter Clara, but 7 years ago, the liver that matched your mother was sought by Clara, with Jake's help, risking her own life. Why do you still hate my daughter? These were things my dad had only recently found out. A few days ago at the airport, he noticed Ethan's extremely cold attitude. He couldn't help but wonder if he had done something wrong when I broke up with Ethan 7 years ago. After checking a bit, all he found was that I had begged Jake back then to help Lily find a matching liver. As for other matters, like my marriage to Jake and separating from Ethan, he probably figured it out quickly. That night, I saw him holding my urn, saying, "You were always Daddy's little treasure. You were not a bad child. Daddy knows best, Clara. You were wronged." I wasn't that noble to sacrifice my own life. I just knew Jake's possessiveness and playboy nature. When I agreed to marry him in exchange for Lily's successful liver transplant, I was thinking ahead. When Jake got tired of me soon, I could leave him and explain everything to Ethan. Maybe I wouldn't even need to explain. Ethan would understand. He knew me so well, he could always read my mind. But things never went as planned. Jake held on to me unwillingly for nearly 2 years before letting me go. And that accident happened so suddenly. I didn't have a chance to talk to Ethan properly. Ethan had no idea that the liver his mother received was somehow connected to me. Upon hearing my dad's words, his eyes shook violently. In an instant, he seemed to have received a sharp and unimaginable blow. At first, he was shocked and disbelieving. Then slowly memories from 7 years ago began to resurface, connecting the dots bit by bit. And in that moment, everything suddenly made sense, providing the most rational truth and explanation. Countless things he had failed to understand in those 7 years now began to unveil their true nature before his eyes. For 7 years, such a long time. After 7 years, the so-called truth, the so-called explanations, had already lost their meanings. The shock in Ethan's eyes dissipated, leaving only a deep sense of despair and confusion. My dad, looking at the man in front of him with a pained and twisted expression, remained indifferent. Ethan, all these 7 years, did you think that my daughter could be that kind of person? Ethan looked blankly at my dad. The face that once seemed perfect in my eyes was now drained of color. He seemed speechless, unable to utter a word. It was as if someone had suddenly grabbed his throat. His breathing became labored, on the brink of suffocation. His complexion changed from pale to a bluish-purple hue, as if lacking oxygen. It was as if he had suddenly stopped breathing, his expression one of pain and distortion. My dad shook his head slightly, tugging at the corner of his mouth with a touch of sadness. My daughter, if she really were the kind of person who loves money and power. Back then, in our prime, admired by wealthy and powerful suitors, letting her choose freely. And then there was you, Ethan, from a humble background. What was it all about? Ethan stammered with thin lips, hesitated for a long time, standing frozen, his eye sockets now red. He trembled all over, but still tried to live in his own world. I don't believe this. Clara couldn't possibly be dead. She must be intentionally hiding from me, but where is she? My dad with a look of complete disappointment in his eyes. After 7 years of hard work, Ethan had finally made a name for himself. Surely he hurried back to the country, eager to find my daughter and perhaps show off a bit, right? Without a doubt, this hit a nerve with Ethan. If there was someone he wanted to impress the most with his current achievements, it was naturally me. Ethan, the renowned head of a technology company, now even more impressive than Jake. How perfect it would be to vent his frustrations in front of his ex-girlfriend, who had once admired him. Perhaps this was the biggest motivation for him to climb the ladder with all his might over the past 7 years. Ethan continued to shake his head, his expression gradually becoming strange and erratic. No, Clara can't be dead. I'll go find her, he said as he stumbled and tried to walk out of the ward. My dad looked at him coldly and spoke softly again. When my daughter came to visit, she brought you to show me. She told me excitedly how much you and she were in sync. In the end, it all comes down to one sentence. My dad's voice faltered slightly, and with a sigh, he added the last sentence. It's Clara. It's our family. We misjudged you, overestimated you. A pang of bitterness surged in my eyes as I closed them. There were some things that I myself had been unwilling to admit or face in these 7 years. The man I had once loved wholeheartedly. I now could believe that I could be the kind of woman who was greedy and abandoned love for vanity. In this world, there is no such thing as flawless acting. I played a role, but he believed in it. For 7 years, he never doubted. When I took my last breath covered in blood after the accident, my beloved, the man I had cherished, was busy plotting how to gain more money and power, causing me pain and regret. It turned out he didn't understand me after all. After my dad said those words, it seemed like he had exhausted all his emotions. With an empty look on his face, he left the ward before Ethan. Ethan stood still for a long time, his face drained of color. It wasn't until much later that he seemed to finally awaken from his dream. Turning back, he dashed out in a frenzy, wanting to catch up to my dad. "Where is Clara? Please tell me where she is." But my dad was nowhere to be seen in the corridor. For 7 years, Ethan had been climbing the corporate ladder with ruthless determination, seemingly unstoppable. But at that moment, it was as if he had been stripped of his backbone. As he walked down the corridor, his body swayed violently. Even though he immediately reached out to support himself on the wall, his body felt as weak as mud, and he slumped to the ground. Countless eyes turned toward him. As they looked at this man in expensive attire, once dignified and noble, now sitting on the ground with his dignity lost, looking disheveled and miserable to many, he seemed like a huge joke. But he seemed oblivious, staggering to his feet once more, stumbling his way to the end of the corridor, muttering to himself in a voice devoid of any composure, "Just see me. At least see me. We promised we should sit down and talk about anything." Did I say something like that? My memory seemed to be failing. But since Ethan said it, we probably did say it 7 years ago. Look at this man, saying he loves me yet not truly understanding me, saying he doesn't love me, but remembering those words said 7 years ago. It's quite contradictory. Perhaps after death, the soul's emotions also become dull and numb. At this moment, looking at him in this state, I felt as if I had very few emotions left. Ethan went to find my dad again, but for several days in a row, my dad refused to see him. Lily was devastated, fell ill, and slipped into a coma for several days, and had to be rushed to the emergency room. As soon as her condition improved slightly, she went directly to my house. Being almost 60 years old, she knelt outside my house alongside Ethan, begging to see my dad one more time, begging to see my ashes. But what could a handful of ashes show? My dad probably felt he had said everything that day to Ethan, but unfortunately, the end result was just Ethan not believing it. He didn't even manage to offer an apology or a word of gratitude on behalf of his daughter. So this time, no matter what he said, my dad was unwilling to see them again. Only in the wee hours of the following night, he saw Ethan still kneeling outside my house in the pouring rain. He must have a soft heart as he sent a message. Don't come here. Clara is no longer here, and whatever you have to say, she can't hear it. I don't have anything I want to hear either, whether it's an apology, regret, guilt, or gratitude. 7 long years have passed, and now bringing it up won't make any difference emotionally or factually. In the pouring rain, the figure slowly got up and walked away, disappearing into the rain curtain like a wandering soul. My dad looked out the window, watching until the figure vanished, then squatted down slowly. Holding my ashes, he gently caressed them as he did when I was a child, with his warm and large palm. He whispered to the ashes, "Clara didn't say forgive. How could I forgive you on her behalf?" He had aged. 7 years had left many traces of time on his face. That night, Ethan went to find Jake. Perhaps after days of heartache, he suddenly remembered that Jake held many truths that only he knew. When he arrived at the nightclub VIP room, he heard Jake calling out to the girl in his arms. The room was filled with alcohol fumes, and Ethan entered, witnessing several girls who bore at least a 6 or 7-point resemblance to me, with one looking almost identical to me, indicating multiple plastic surgeries. Jake, inebriated, greeted Ethan with a smirk and explained that the girls were lookalikes hired to pose as Clara on social media. A brawl broke out as Ethan, enraged, punched Jake to the ground. Jake, bloody but still laughing, taunted Ethan for falling for the elaborate deception. Jake continued to taunt Ethan, revealing his manipulations to ensure Lily's liver transplant failed, leading to my death in a car accident years later. The forgotten truth emerged, reigniting the intense pain and regret of that fateful day. Ethan, overwhelmed by emotions, unleashed his fury on Jake, the room echoing with the sound of shattering glass and Ethan's muttered curses. As Jake lay unconscious on the floor, Ethan, emotionally drained, slammed his fist onto the table, blood dripping from his wounded hand. The room fell silent, except for the sound of blood dripping onto the floor. The fist didn't loosen, instead pressed harder onto the pile of broken glass. On the coffee table, a spreading pool of bright red became more visible. He sat there silently, letting the glass pieces keep piercing the back of his hand, allowing the blood on the coffee table to increase. I turned my gaze away. At this point, maybe it wasn't about feeling sorry, just finding the blood color somewhat unsettling. Ethan remained seated in desolate silence. It was well into the night when Jake woke up. Sitting up, both exhausted, they locked eyes. I watched, finding it almost amusing. Truly, there was no feeling left. 7 years, one heart. All the pain was long gone. Jake looked at him, and after a long while, somewhat absent-mindedly said, "I actually know that night 5 years ago when I divorced Clara. She called you, wanting to get back together, right?" He continued, pulling a self-deprecating smile. "I lied to her that night, told her I had found someone new and was divorcing her. The look of relief in her eyes, I still remember it." His voice paused slightly, and then that night, "You flew back overseas, right? I remembered Lily didn't finish her sentence earlier. So 5 years ago, Ethan indeed came back. With his eyes turning a bright red, Ethan didn't say anything. It was an acknowledgement. Jake went on by himself. "That night, you went to her apartment to see her. but ended up seeing me kissing her outside the door. But you sure didn't know. That night she was drunk, clinging to my neck, calling me Ethan. She said, "It's a shame. Ethan is getting married. Doesn't want her anymore." She said, she thought maybe there was still hope. I saw Ethan stiffen abruptly. Time almost seemed to freeze for about a minute. Then I witnessed great sorrow appearing on his face. Suddenly, tears streamed down his face, a sight I had never seen before. From the first drop of tear, it seemed like he had lost control. Tears kept falling. He sat there stiffly, as if at that moment, all hope was lost. After a while, I heard a sound coming from his throat, a desperate, animal-like sob. Jake got up and left the room, dragging his body behind him. That night, Ethan sat by the coffee table for a long time. It wasn't until dawn that he seemed to have made up his mind in a confused state. He stood up decisively, without any hesitation, leaned on the sofa and the wall, and left the room. His phone rang, but he might not have heard it, as he didn't answer it at all. The ringtone sounded multiple times. With a numb look, he walked into the elevator and left the place. I heard him muttering repeatedly to himself, "Clara Maya is just my secretary, not my girlfriend. I know you always disliked her before, minding her pursuing me. I just wanted you to care. These 7 years, I never looked for anyone else. But what to do? What to do? You can't hear it. You can't hear anything now." I blinked, turned my gaze away, not wanting to see him anymore. As I walked out, the street outside was bustling with traffic. I watched Ethan walk straight toward the street, his steps never stopping. In a low and baffled voice, almost fading in the wind, but I still heard it. "Clara, I can't just leave it like this, can I? I can't. Can I not even say sorry to you?" I didn't know what he meant. Maybe his mind was really not clear. "I'm already dead. What more can he do?" Until he crossed the street, his steps still unbroken, headed straight into the traffic lane. Only then did I realize what was happening, and a bad premonition arose in me. He kept muttering to himself, "We promised, even with gray hair, we would still walk hand in hand for a lifetime. Clara, you won't come back, so I'll go find you." At the intersection, a sharp sound of brakes echoed, but with the traffic too dense, it was like a tidal wave of cars. It was too late to brake, and then I heard a loud crash. It was the sound of a body hitting a car, a chilling sound. Just like the day of my accident, the dull, despairing, deathly sound. Asterisk, asterisk. Epilogue. Asterisk, asterisk. I let out a sharp scream, but no one could see me. No one could hear my voice. Blood everywhere. Everything around me plunged into chaos. Screams, cries, and the sound of ambulance sirens filled the air. My soul lost consciousness, and when I woke up, it was already half a year later. My soul was extremely weak. This was probably the last time I would see things in this world. After Ethan's accident, he was rescued for a day and a night but never woke up. Lily sat by his bedside, her expression hollow and lifeless. In just half a year, she had turned all white, looking like she had aged decades. The doctor made the final conclusion that Ethan would never wake up. Maybe he would die tomorrow. Maybe he would just lie there forever, keeping a breath, becoming a lifelong vegetable. Before that accident, Ethan had already taken care of some things. He asked our relatives to give my dad some money. He also contacted the best experts from overseas to treat my sister's illness. On the day my soul woke up after half a year, almost like a spiritual connection, my sister miraculously woke up too. She was accompanied by my dad, and they stayed in the hospital to recuperate. I stayed by their side and took one last good look at them. It was a beautiful sunny day. My dad unlocked my metaphorical shackles and spent time with my sister basking in the sun on the hospital lawn. I overheard them talking about me. They mentioned how mischievous I was as a child, once getting into a fight and scratching a boy's face, making him cry. Who was that little boy again? It seemed to be Ethan, but Ethan never argued with me. Probably Jake. I tried to remember but couldn't. But as they talked about me, it felt like we were a family of 3 sitting together. After many years, I finally saw my dad and sister smile. I quietly moved closer, hugged my dad, then hugged my sister. And with that, this life, for now, was goodbye. Jake turned himself in at the police station. Bribery, colluding with doctors, and his shady business dealings from these years were all exposed by himself. The court trial was imminent. 10 years, maybe 20. He looked numb as he was driven away by the police. Finally, I went to the hospital and looked at Ethan one last time. He lay quietly on the hospital bed, connected to a breathing apparatus. I was dead, but there was still one living soul for now. And he was like this. Probably even his soul was asleep. I couldn't help but move closer, looking at him. It seemed like he could feel it. A tear fell from the corner of his eye. Luckily, Lily was asleep leaning on the bedside. No one noticed. I was shocked, then breathed a sigh of relief. In that moment, I also felt a bit sad. As New Year's Eve approached, the city had its first snowfall. I saw white snowflakes falling on the windowsill outside the ward. I was reminded of many years ago, the day I first met Ethan. Under the snow-covered bridge, I handed him breakfast, which he initially rejected. Carefully, I said, "I just bought this. Haven't eaten it, don't think it's dirty." He hesitated for a moment, but eventually accepted it. Later, because of that breakfast, he stood in front of me countless times. 10 years together, half a year in prison. He had loved me deeply, disregarding everything. In the end, he was defeated by a lie. I remembered many snowy days afterward. Ethan would gently hold my hands in his palms. At that time, the young man's features were as beautiful as the snowy ground, filled with love and longing. He said, "I hope that when our hair turns white with age, we can still be together, hand in hand, for the rest of our lives." But that captivating face could never be matched with the man in the hospital bed today. I closed my eyes, and finally the awareness of my soul also faded away. That young man, who loved and protected me, now only lived on in my memories,